And then we're recording. Brilliant. Welcome, Carla.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Loving your bookshelf. That looks beautiful.
Thank you. I need to angle it so you can see my book a bit better, actually, don't I?
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. Oh, beautiful. Loving your work. Right. I shall hand over to your brilliant talk, sure to get us rethinking. Over to you, empowering men and leaders to be allies for gender equity.
Thanks, Eleanor. Have you heard of the allyship gap? Probably not. I hadn't heard of it until relatively recently. But basically, 77% of men think that they are doing everything possible to create and advance gender equity in the workplace, which is fantastic. Unfortunately, only 41% of women think that men are doing everything possible to create and advance gender equity in the workplace. What I'm going to share with you today is some ways in which you can close that allyship gap, and also tell you about another gap that you probably haven't heard of either. So, hi, my name's Carla Miller. I'm a leadership and confidence coach for women. I'm also the founder of Be Bolder Training, and we provide leadership and confidence coaching and courses such as our Be Bolder Confidence course and our women's leadership masterclasses and courses. I'm also an author of the book Closing the Influence Gap, a practical guide for women leaders who want to be heard, which was named by Management Today magazine as one of the must-read books in 2022, hoping that also applies to 2023, and has just been shortlisted for the Business Book Award, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that. I'm also the host of the Influence and Impact podcast for female leaders, which generally sits in the top 20 of the Apple management charts. Now, we know that gender equity and having more diverse leadership teams has fantastic results for an organization. It makes it more profitable. It gives you a bigger and better labor supply. It reduces your turnover and therefore your recruitment costs, and it provides increased productivity via employee motivation. And obviously, I am all for developing women. That's what I spend my days doing. So why am I here talking about men and leaders as allies? Why does allyship matter? Well, let's talk about men first. So studies show that engaging men makes a huge difference. When men are deliberately engaged in gender inclusion initiatives, 96% of organizations see progress, as opposed to just 30% of organizations where men are not engaged. And your men may well be engaging, but where are they on the allyship spectrum? So diversity consultant Jennifer Brown came up with this spectrum to demonstrate the different levels of allyship that you see within organizations. So at the bottom of the spectrum, you've got apathetic, where men are disinterested regarding gender issues. The next level up is aware. So they have some grasp of the issues, but not at all active or engaged in addressing them. When you've got active allies, then they're well informed, they're willing to engage in gender equity efforts, but only when you ask them. So they're probably fantastic on International Women's Day, but it doesn't come up apart from that. And what we want to work towards is having men and leaders as advocates for gender inclusion within the workplace, where they routinely and proactively champion gender inclusion. And what we hope to do in this talk and in the training that I offer, the male allyship training, is to move people one step up that spectrum by giving them really practical strategies that they can use, helping them understand the issue and doing it in a way that feels very non-judgmental and very inclusive. So we all know that there's a gender pay gap. We also are probably aware that there is inequity in terms of men and women being promoted. So for every 100 men promoted to manager level, only 85 women are promoted. And this is like the first level of management level. So this is probably before you've got children, you've got women having children, taking maternity leave. We can't blame it on that. Actually, there's a level of bias involved just in getting to this first rung of management, which is why it's often called that broken rung of management. But the gap that you may not have heard of is the influence gap. And this is what I spend a lot of my time talking about. And this is the fact that women can be sitting at top tables sometimes and still not getting their voice heard. They struggle to be taken as seriously as their male colleagues, despite being extremely competent. In fact, many studies show that in many ways, women are more competent leaders than men, but because they often appear less confident, they are less likely to be promoted, but also to get their voice heard. And we also know that women have to prove their competence in a way that men don't. And we talk about this within my male allyship training. And I thought the perfect area to focus on in this short talk would be meetings, because meetings are a microcosm of all sorts of different behaviors. And they're a really simple, easy way to make changes and see a real difference in women feeling seen and heard and valued in the organization. So I'm going to share with you how you can be an ally in meetings. And we're going to look at three particular areas. We're going to look at how much airspace women get in meetings and what you can do about that. We're going to talk about tackling and dealing with interruptions. And then we're going to talk about how can you amplify women's voices in meetings if they are not being heard, if they're making points but not really getting the credit for the points that they're making. And what's the cost of this? What's the cost of not hearing women's voices fully in meetings? Well, obviously it feeds into the gender pay gap, and it feeds into the fact that there are less women in senior roles than there are men. It's impacting your pipeline. But right now, organizations are missing out on the input and ideas of half of the workforce because they're not able to express them as fully in the room as their male colleagues are. This is also making women feel less valued, and we know that women leaders are leaving organizations at the highest rate ever. So it's fantastic sending them on courses like the ones that I offer them, but it's also really helpful. If you're going to make them more confident, then you need to make everyone else comfortable with women being more confident. So let's talk about airspace and how we can get better at passing the microphone to the women in the room. Studies show that equal speaking time for women in meetings is correlated with better team performance. It makes teams more creative and effective in their problem solving, and it increases psychological safety within teams. All good. But in mixed gender meetings, women speak on average 25% less than men, and they struggle to be heard. Sometimes they literally cannot get a word in edgeways, and maybe you've been in meetings like that. Interestingly, in 2017, there was a study of 155,000 company conference calls that found that men spoke 92% of the time on those calls. Another study showed that when women spoke as much as men in a meeting, men felt that they were dominating the discussion. So we have this default in our mind of how much men and women should speak in a meeting. And we all have that, not just men. And when a woman speaks more than that, it just doesn't feel right to us, unless we become conscious that we've got a default that isn't helpful. So what can we do about this? There are some really simple, easy ways that you can pass the mic to women in meetings. So the first one that everyone can do is you can chair meetings fairly and effectively. This would generally make meetings much better for everybody in the room. So, for example, make sure everybody gets an opportunity to contribute. Now, you don't have to pick on people one at a time. People don't always enjoy that. But just saying, has anyone else got anything that they want to add to this conversation? Has anyone not had a chance yet to contribute their ideas? You can also avoid allowing more vocal individuals to dominate decision-making and to dominate the discussion. So you can say, that's great. We've had a lot of great thoughts from you, John. It would be great to hear what some others in the room think to that, or to hear responses to that. So you can do it in a really polite way, but it's just balancing it so that you've not got the people who like speaking the most and the people who are most confident being the only voices in the room. Now, the other thing you can do is agree virtual meeting etiquette that includes how people can indicate that they like to speak. I spend my time talking to women a lot, and they're like, I literally cannot get a word in edgeways, particularly virtually. And so if you agree this beforehand, then everyone knows how it works. So it might include using the chat box to say, there's something I'd like to contribute here. It might mean raising your virtual hand. It might be unmuting yourself, but agreeing as part of your standard meeting etiquette that when someone wants to contribute something, there's a way, or wants to speak, there's a way that they can indicate that they want that to happen, and that people will respect that and create space so that someone can contribute. Now, another way to hear more female voices in the room is to increase the amount of women that are in the room and to give women equal opportunity to present in decision-making meetings. So if there's an opportunity to present to people at the next level, making sure that you're giving women equal opportunity to do that. And if you're sat there and feeling like a woman is talking too much, then before you jump to that assumption, just notice for a minute how long the men are talking for and check that you're holding standards that are fair, because many of us don't do that. So those are some simple things that you can do to pass the mic to the women in the room. Now, another issue that comes up a lot for women in meetings, and it's not exclusive to women, but women do have to deal with being interrupted on a daily basis. One study showed that men interrupted women 33% more often than they interrupted other men. And another study showed that women get interrupted 50% of the time that they talk, and 96% of those interruptions came from men. Now, with everything I'm sharing here, this is not all men, not all women, but these are studies that show that these are very clear trends and experiences. And whenever I share these in workshops, there is usually a whole host of comments of people sharing their own experiences, or comments from people not realizing that this was actually happening. Now, do women interrupt as well? Of course they do. But when women and men interrupt using the same words, women are judged as being colder, ruder, and less intelligent than men. And that's just another example of gender bias coming into play. So what can we do about these interruptions? So we all interrupt other people sometimes, whatever our gender, but we can start to notice it and to change our behavior. So if you've interrupted someone, and I still quite frequently find myself interrupting someone, notice. So clock it in your head that they're still talking and you're talking. Apologize and let the original speaker continue. So that might sound like, sorry, I just interrupted you. Please continue. If you're being interrupted, you can point out that you haven't finished talking yet. Now, that might sound like one moment. And if you need to, you can raise your hand a little bit to indicate that you're still talking, or you can say, I'd like to finish my point, and then hand over to you. Now, sometimes you can't continue your points. Sometimes perhaps you've been interrupted by someone more senior than you, or somebody who will just blast on through with their talking. What you can try and do in that situation is to reclaim the floor straight afterwards. So don't let other people leap in on that. You can say, as I was saying, or the point that I was making. So reclaim that microphone or the floor as soon as you can afterwards, because otherwise your moment has completely gone and it would be really hard to get it back again, because it would feel like you're going back a long way in what's been covered in the meeting. And again, chairing is so important. So chair meetings effectively so that interruptions aren't indulged. So if you've got someone who's a serial interrupter, then pull them up on it, call them out on it. Or if someone has interrupted, then say, actually, sorry, I think you've been interrupted. Would you like to finish what you're saying? Now you can do that if you're chairing, but you can also, anyone in the room can do that. So if you notice someone being interrupted, it can be really awkward to say, I'm still talking, or to try and continue talking. Sometimes if you push that, then people pay more attention to the tension around the situation than they do to what you were trying to say in the first place. So you can help someone out if they've been interrupted. It's a lot less awkward. So you might say, Monique, you're interrupted, or Monique, I don't think you quite finished making your point. I'd like to hear the rest of your thoughts on that topic. And then the final thing that you can do in meetings to be a fantastic ally is to amplify the voices of women in the room. So at least 38% of women have experienced others taking credit for their ideas in meetings. And women often share stories of something that's become known as heap-eating, where a man makes a point in a meeting which gets ignored, but a woman makes a point in a meeting which gets ignored. And then when a man repeats that same point, everyone listens. Now, they might have made it in a slightly different way, but this is happening consistently. And then the women are sitting there going, did I not communicate that clearly? Is there something wrong with my communication skills, or am I not credible enough that people are not listening to me? And actually, men have basically been trained by society to listen to and value the opinion of other men over the women in the room. And that's what we want to overcome, that bias that's inbuilt in all of us. Now, in 2008, the women in President Obama's team, who are obviously some of the most intelligent women in politics in the USA at the time, noticed that they were the workplace minority. And they noticed that they weren't being recognized for the contributions that they made to meetings. So they were being called on less. And when they were called on, they'd make a great point. No one paid much attention. Their male colleague would make an extremely similar, if not the same point, and everyone would think it was the best thing ever. They got together to talk about this and problem solve, and they adopted and came up with a strategy that they called amplification. Amplification is basically when a woman made a point in the meeting, other women would repeat it, giving credit to its author. So they were basically echoing the fact that the woman had made that point and it was a fantastic point. This made sure that women were recognized for their contribution. Now, Obama soon cottoned on to this strategy, noticed the indifference that had been there, and called on the women more than he had done. And in fact, in his next cabinet, if that's what they call it in America, he had more women than he had done previously. And we all know that Obama is a feminist, thanks to Michelle. Now, the other reason that women's voices might need to be amplified is, according to McKinsey and Company, senior women are twice as likely as women overall to be onlys. So the only or one of the only women in the room. And studies show that women who are onlys experience more microaggressions, including needing to provide additional evidence of their competence. And women of colour are often an only in two ways and are even more likely to be on the other end of disrespectful behaviour. So how can you amplify women's voices in the room? And anyone can do this. So women can do it for other women, anyone can do it. And it doesn't just need to be women's voices, it could be any group that is underrepresented in senior rooms, because they won't be being heard as clearly as the others in the room are. So two things you can do. Firstly, speak up to make sure the originator of an idea gets the credit for it, not the person who repeated it, even if that person is building on the point. So you might say, thanks for building on Amber's point, Charles. Really interesting idea there. Is there anything more you want to add to that, Amber? So you're not belittling someone for contributing to a meeting, but you are making sure that people understand where the original thought came from. Another thing you can do is that make sure that after the meeting, if there's minutes, that the originator of the thought, in this case Amber, is credited on the minutes for the contribution that they made. It's amazing how often it says Charles came up with a fantastic point and Amber sat there going, what? And then if you're the person who's building on someone else's point in a meeting, then be sure to mention that it's their point. There is absolutely nothing wrong with building on someone else's point. But if you present it as original thought, people might well forget who came up with the idea in the first place and prompted that idea in your head. Now, the second thing you can do is that you can generally amplify the voices of women by championing the women that you work with and helping to increase their visibility. Create opportunities for them to be in rooms with senior colleagues, showing what they can do. So you might say something like, Joe did a brilliant job presenting and secured a large deal yesterday. So raising Joe's profile when she's not in the room. Or I think Nita would add value to this meeting with her sector experience. Shall we bring her in? So we're not bringing women in for the sake of it. We're bringing them in because we think they will add value to this conversation, and because they're less likely to be in that room in the first place. So if you put those simple changes into place, you'll have better meetings, and better meetings mean women have equal airspace, there are less interruptions, and women are getting credit and visibility for what they can offer to the organization. So that's how men can be allies. Now, the other thing I wanted to cover in this talk is the role that managers and leaders can play in allyship as well. So this is beyond meetings. These are some simple ways. I mean, there are many, many ways, but I've picked 3 ways for you that managers and leaders can act as allies for the women that work with them. So the first idea is to look under the umbrella. Now, this is an idea from Jill Whitty Collins, who wrote the fantastic book, Why Men Win at Work. And she shares her experience where she was, I think she was a VP of marketing at Procter & Gamble. And she was one of numerous peers, and they were all men, and her line manager was a man. And they would have meetings every week. And at these meetings, her male colleagues would be bringing the crises that they had solved and that they had to deal with on a weekly basis. And she'd be sitting there feeling a bit smug, thinking, well, those are not crises. Those are just problems that need solving. And I solve problems like that all the time. I don't need to bring them to this meeting. So she was feeling very capable until it got to the end of the year and everyone had their reviews and their pay increases. And despite the fact that her team had outperformed the others, she wasn't given a pay increase and the others were. And when she questioned it, she was told, well, your job obviously hasn't been as hard as the others. You haven't had all these crises to deal with. And what she realized is what the men in the room were doing was drawing attention to what they were doing, showing their value, telling their value, whilst she had been believing in a meritocracy, basically, that if she worked hard and did a good job, that it would be recognized. And men and women do believe that work should be a meritocracy in that way. And she describes it as we have an umbrella over us. So our line manager is sitting on top of the umbrella, and unless you show them what's going on underneath, they have not much idea about how you're spending your time. They don't see the problems that you solve, the strategic thinking that you put into place. They only really see what you tell them and what you show them. So if you are line managing people, then just make sure you are looking under the umbrella, particularly for women, because they are unlikely to feel as comfortable telling you about what they're doing and their successes and their achievements, because society trains women to feel really uncomfortable. That feels very boastful for us in a way that it doesn't seem to for most men. So look under the umbrella. Now, the second thing you can do is make sure that you are giving equitable feedback. So studies show that men and women receive different feedback. Whilst men are often given feedback that prepares them for leadership, so we'll talk about being strategic, being in senior rooms, building relationships with people who can develop your career, taking on high-profile projects, women are much more likely to be given feedback that doesn't prepare them for leadership, like play nicely with your peers, build those relationships, and also they're more likely to be given vague feedback. So feedback like you should be more confident, when actually that's not very helpful to them and just labels them as unconfident. Instead, you could be saying, in this situation, this is what it would look like to show up more confidently. Or next time I'd like to see you doing, oh, sorry, just unplugged my computer by accident. Next time I'd like to see you doing more of this. So get specific in your feedback. Make sure that you are providing women with feedback that is preparing them for leadership, not preparing them to sit nicely where they are for a really long time. And then finally, studies show that women are much more likely to receive negative personality-based feedback. And there is a whole repertoire of words that are only applied to women and not applied to men. So check your language as well. Before you're about to communicate to a woman on their behavior, then think, would I use this same phrase when communicating this to a man? And in fact, if this was a man, would I even give this feedback? So you can really work on your feedback to make it more equitable. And then the final thing you can do is make sure that you're valuing different approaches. When you operate in a male dominated industry, sector, organization, there is often a particular, very masculine way of leading, and that does not suit everyone. It doesn't suit most women. Also, probably doesn't suit quite a lot of the men. But if you find that you have got everyone at the top of the organization has a very similar management and leadership style, if you're only celebrating certain types of leadership attributes, then people will look at that and think, well, it's not acceptable for me to do it in a different way. That leaves you with less diversity, but it also doesn't leave much room for women. So women face a double bind. If we show up and communicate and operate in and lead in the way that society trains women to show up, so for example, putting other people's needs before our own, not talking about our successes and achievements, then we get overlooked in the world of work. If we try and copy or act like a man in our approach, we are judged negatively for that as well, because it doesn't sit with what we expect of women. It's really, really hard for women to find that middle way. And I spend a lot of time working with them on how they can find a style that is authentic and powerful. But that isn't much use if you don't value different approaches to leadership, if you don't value different leadership attributes. And it was really interesting and fantastic to see actually that during COVID-19 and the lockdowns that happened here in the UK, Deloitte brought out a survey basically saying the leadership skills that we need at this moment in time include adaptability and empathy. Now, these are leadership skills that many women have been trained by society to have, and that have been undervalued and people have dismissed in the past. So it's great to start to see larger corporate organizations starting to value those different approaches. So we've covered things that you can do in meetings to be an ally. We've covered things that managers and leaders can do to be better allies. We've talked about why we need to have allies. So I'd like to finish with a question to you, which is, having heard all of this, what one action will you take to be a better ally to women in your workplace today?